It was at the picture exhibition of the same year, 1809, that the emperor wished to be represented in full length in his cabinet and gave orders that I should appear in that picture, writing from his dictation. The painter Garnier received the order to execute this portrait. I did not happen to be in Paris whilst the painter was working at it, for I had accompanied the emperor on one of his journeys. The painter Isabey was good enough to make up for this drawback by helping Garnier with his memory, and on my return to Paris, Garnier asked me to sit for him so that he might give the last touches to his work. I do not know in what way it came to the emperor's ears that the execution of this picture left a good deal to be desired, but he ordered General Duroc to write on the subject to Monsieur Denon, Director General Museums, who took the painter's defense. At last, the picture was accepted and placed in one of the galleries at the Tuileries. In 1814, it was relegated to the lumber room, with all those which had for subject the history of the usurper, or else it was given back to the author, as were other pictures of the same kind, which were restored to their painters. Found in 1839 at a picture dealer's by the son of one of my old friends, Count Lemerroy, he bought it from attachment to the emperor's memory and in remembrance of the friendship which bound me to his father. At the beginning of the year 1809, the emperor at last decided to fill the two places of secretary to the cabinet which had been created in 1804. One of the new secretaries was charged, amongst other functions, with translating the foreign papers and periodicals, and entered, though rarely, Napoleon's cabinet. This was Baron Meunier, auditor to the Council of State, who had been employed at the time of the War of 1806-1807 in the government of the province of Silesia. Monsieur Meunier was the son of the deputy of the Constituent Assembly, whom Napoleon had recalled from exile and whose capacity and merit he had rewarded by appointing him, on his return to France, prefect of Rennes, and afterwards by calling him to a post at the Council of State. The emperor's esteem for the father descended upon the son, who was an intelligent and well-informed young man of much promise, which later he fully realized. The second secretary of the cabinet, who was specially charged with all concerning artillery and engineering, was Baron de Ponton, at that time colonel of engineers. He had taken part in the memorable campaign in Egypt and enjoyed a well-deserved reputation in his branch of the service. This officer afterwards became lieutenant general and a member of the Committee of Engineers. The emperor completed his cabinet later on by placing at the head of his topographical office Colonel Bachelet d'Albe, who afterwards became general. He was the author of the military map of Italy, was endowed with the most happy facility for the arts, and was animated with what Napoleon used to call the sacred fire. D'Albe was assisted by two geographical engineers of merit, Messieurs Lameau and Duvivier. In forcing the emperor to return at full speed from Spain, the coalition effected the objects it had in view, namely preventing the pacification of this country and of dividing our forces. The emperor heard by telegraph on April 12th that the Archduke Charles had entered Bavaria and that his troops had passed the Inn without any previous declaration of war. This declaration was only notified to the outposts on the morrow of the day on which the invasion had taken place. Napoleon left the Élysée on the 13th of April at 4 in the morning. He passed on with unheard of speed and reached headquarters at Donauwörth on the 5th day, after having stopped at Louisburg and Dillingen to see the kings of Württemberg in Bavaria. The emperor found Marshal Berthier at Donauwörth. He learned there that through a misunderstanding of his orders, the communications between the corps of Bavarians commanded by Marshal Lefebvre and Marshal Davout's corps was cut off. New activity was given to his genius by the necessity of repairing this fault. The battles of Thann and of Ebensburg won with the troops of the Confederation of the Rhine the victory of Eckmühl, which earned for Marshal Davout the title of Prince of Eckmühl, bestowed later, were results of these clever maneuvers. So rapid had been the movements that Napoleon's household had not been able to follow him, and that he had to live like a soldier, only riding borrowed horses. I have often heard the emperor complain of how inferior we were to the Romans. Yet, according to the best military writers, he had no reason to envy any one of the heroes of antiquity, either for the rapidity of the marches or for the preciseness of the maneuvers which were characterized the commencement of this campaign. Two occurrences marked this victorious march. The first might have deprived the army of its leader. Napoleon was seated on a spot from which he could see the attack on the town of Ratisbon. He was beating the ground with his riding whip when a bullet, supposed to have been fired from a Tyrolean carbine, struck him on the big toe. The news of this wound spread rapidly from file to file, and he was forced to mount on horseback to show himself to the troops. Although his boot had not been cut, the wound was a very painful one. Napoleon, however, put on a good face on the matter, but nature would not forgo her rights. On returning from this short excursion to a small house which was at a distance of some gun ranges from the spot where he had been wounded, his courage being exhausted, he fainted right away. This wound had, fortunately, no evil consequences. A feat of arms of unparalleled bravery, the taking by storm of the Ebensburg position, which was reputed inexpugnable, was marked at this campaign. The wooden bridge of more than 600 feet in length, protected by a stronghold and precipitous heights, which were crowned by superior forces and 100 pieces of artillery, was carried by General Cohorn. The gates of the city were broken down, and a most violent encounter ensued. The houses in which a number of wounded soldiers and combatants had been driven back without being able to escape caught fire and were burned down to the ground with every man inside them. The sight presented by this unhappy city, with its streets strewn with corpses half consumed by fire and spreading a fearful stench, was one of the most horrible that can be imagined. The emperor was painfully impressed by it. He could not refrain from praising General Cohorn for his rare courage, but he deplored the losses which would have been avoided if Marshal Massena had given orders to turn this position. The emperor saw for a second time the city of Vienna, whose sovereign had sworn to him in 1805 at the memorable interview at the bivouac at Saarauschwitz. He would war on him no more. This time Vienna tried to defend itself. Marshal Lannes had sent Captain Marbeau with a flag of truce, carrying a summons. The young aide-de-camp was attacked by a gang of ruffians, ill-treated and even wounded. Archduke Maximilian approved of the conduct of these wretches by allowing it to pass unreproved and kept the captain prisoner. After this violation of international law and the refusal of the Archduke to open the gates of the city, a bombardment was decided upon. It has been stated in error that Archduchess Marie-Louise, being ill, had remained behind in the imperial palace. It has been added that on hearing this, the emperor gave orders that the cannon should not be fired in that direction. The human mind hankers too much after the belief that great men have a mysterious foresight to their destinies. Archduke Maximilian, frightened perhaps at the responsibility which he had assumed, left Vienna hastily and crossed the bridges without leaving any orders. On May 12th, a French army occupied Vienna after that city had capitulated, at the request of a deputation which was presented to the emperor at Schönbrunn, where he had taken up his quarters. Napoleon assured the delegates of his protection and promised them that the city of Vienna should be treated with the same consideration as at the time of the first occupation in 1805. The emperor remained a week at Schönbrunn. In the meanwhile, the island of Lobau, which is situated at a distance of 2 leagues from Vienna, and which divides the Danube into several branches, was occupied by the French army with the view of establishing a point at which our troops could cross the river. 3 bridges were thrown across it, thanks to which our armies was able to commence to cross on May 20th to attack the enemy on the left bank. But hardly had Marshal Massena got into touch with the Austrian army when a part of the little bridges was broken. The Austrians, masters of the upper reaches of the Danube, set loose large barges filled with stones and cannonballs, which, borne along by the rapidity of the current, which had been increased by a sudden rising of the river, dashed against the bridges, breaking them down into several pieces. The inferiority of strength of our Fourth Corps was compensated for by the heroic tenacity of Massena, and the impetuous courageous of Lannes. The latter, separated from his corps by the breaking down of the bridges, but impatient to take part in the action, marched at the head of the Boudet division, which he directed with the greatest courage. Two armies faced each other during the night. On the morrow, the Second Corps, the Guards, and the cuirassiers were able to cross the bridges, which had been repaired during the night. Marshal Davout's corps was to follow, as also the other corps as they came up. The Battle of Essling, which had been suspended the day before, began again, and victory, the price of the most vigorous efforts, was just about to declare itself for us when the sinister report that the big bridge had broken down was suddenly spread. Anything beyond keeping our ground until the end of the day and returning at nightfall to the island of Essling became out of the question. This critical position was to be aggravated by the cruel loss which the emperor and the army experienced in the person of Marshal Lannes. A spent cannonball shattered both legs of this valiant soldier. When the emperor saw the litter on which the marshal was being carried, his face overdrawn with the pallor of death, he ordered it to be carried to one side, and walking quickly up to throw himself upon the hero who was dying and embraced him with choking sobs. The impression produced by this heartrending scene cannot be described. The emperor's grief was so great that 2 days later, the remembrance of it still filled his eyes with tears in spite of all of his efforts to conceal them. The marshal, transported to the village of Ebersdorf, died there a week later from the consequence of his terrible wounds. In Marshal Lannes, the emperor had had a loss for which he could not console himself. He never wearied in his praises of the merits of one of his oldest comrades in arms. He used to express his astonishment at the way in which each year the marshal developed his talents, his prudence, and his knowledge of the military art. Considered apart from his capacity as a soldier, the Duke of Montebello had an extremely original mind. A book could be made of the piquant energetic and always expressive sayings which escaped him. It was he who said to Monsieur de Talleyrand after the Battle of Austerlitz that victory had sharpened the points of the pen of diplomacy with cuts of the saber. He used to say of Talleyrand's impassiveness that if he were to receive a kick in his seat of honor, his face would not betray the event, and summed him up in this saying, which is perhaps strictly true, if expressed in somewhat too military language. It's a lot of ... mud in a silk stocking. By way of an anecdote, I will speak of an accident which will appear the merest trifle compared to the misfortune which had just robbed the army of a glorious captain. I happened to be on foot on the left bank of the Danube in front of the bridge which communicated with the island of Lobau, when I saw the emperor come up and climb up on top of a mill house to see what was going on. I was looking at him when I felt myself struck with a blow. It was a horse's kick, which stretched me full length on the ground. Napoleon saw me fall just as he was coming down from his point of observation, thought that I was dangerously wounded, and gave orders at once that I should be picked up and transported to the island. I had only been rendered rather dizzy by the blow, so he reassured himself and said, "Get away as fast as you can. You gave me a great fright." I felt no consequences from this accident. General Espana, commanding the cuirassiers, was killed by a cannonball, and General Saint Hilaire was seriously wounded. It was feared at first that we had to deplore the deaths of General Duresnel and Foulet, but we had the satisfaction of learning that the first of these officers had not been wounded at all, and the second only slightly. They had fallen into the hands of the enemy, who sent them back to French headquarters after the Battle of Wagram. The troops who were shut up in the island of Lobau, and especially the wounded, suffered great privations during the first days. Soon, however, stores of provisions and ambulances were established there. Instead of evacuating the island, the emperor had works worthy of the Romans carried out there under the direction of General Bertrand. Napoleon spent 12 days at Ebersdorf, a village situated opposite the island of Lobau, occupied with caring for the wounded and providing for the needs of the soldiers who remained on the island. The works were commenced under his eyes, and he distributed the rest of the army into cantonments, after which he returned to Schönbrunn. The indignation felt by the emperor at the conduct of the Austrian general Chesteler in Tyrol, where 700 French conscripts and 1,800 Bavarians had been massacred in his presence by the rebels, had prompted an order of the day providing that this general, in case he should be made prisoner, should be tried by court-martial and be put to the edge of the sword. The Emperor of Austria, having heard of this order, had declared that Generals Duresnel and Foulet would be kept as hostages to answer for the way in which General Chesteler was treated. When this declaration was notified to Napoleon, he gave necessary orders that the persons of the Prince Colloredo and Metternich, as well as Counts Pergen and Hardegg, who had remained in Vienna, should be seized, and that by way of reprisal, these persons should be conducted to France after their arrest. The emperor at the same time authorized a deputation from the city of Vienna to go to the Austrian sovereign to enlighten him on the particulars of the massacre of French prisoners in Tyrol. Emperor Francis, better informed, retracted his order concerning the two French generals. During the months of April and May, the intrigues of the agents of England and of the coalition had been directed towards raising to insurrection the provinces in the north of Germany which had belonged to Prussia, or which had been dependent on this power. These provinces were filled with former soldiers, prisoners of war who had returned home or who had escaped from the last defeats. Kett, a Prussian officer, had assembled a large number of these persons, had seized on the public treasuries, and had cut off the communications, seeking to stir up the country to revolt. Pursued by the Westphalian troops, he had succeeded in reaching Bohemia, where the remnants of his gang, he had joined the Duke of Brunswick's Ols, who was organizing a corps of volunteers for Austria. This prince, son of the last Duke of Brunswick, who had lost his life at the Battle of Jena, wishing to avenge the death of his father and the ruin of his house, had made himself the leader of secret societies and insurrections in Germany. He had given his corps a black uniform with the emblems of death. Towards the end of April, an aide-de-camp of the King of Westphalia, colonel of the light infantrymen of his guard, a certain Dornberg, at the head of a troop of smugglers and employees, partly military, partly civilian, which had increased by armed peasants recruited in Westphalia and in Hanover, had raised the standard of revolt and had marched on Kassel, hoping to surprise his city, a defenseless state, and had thrown himself back on Magdeburg. The activity and vigor which the young King of Westphalia, seconded by the leaders of his army, had displayed in dealing with this attempt at an insurrection had ended by getting the best of it. But Dornberg, who had been reduced to flight in company with some officers, had succeeded in joining the Duke of Brunswick, who was the soul of all of these revolutionary movements. Shortly afterwards, the Prussian major Schill, former partisan in the war in 1806, marched out of Berlin at the head of 500 hussars of the regiment on the pretext, as it appears, of maneuvers. He was joined by a battalion of infantry, which had formed part of his corps of partisans. After fruitless attempts against the fortresses in the north of Germany, he had drawn back on Westphalia to give a hand to the remainder of Dornberg's insurgents. Schill, having assembled the forces which he considered sufficient, tried a coup de main on Magdeburg, and having failed, marched on the lower Elbe. In the meanwhile, the Duke of Brunswick was tardily entering Saxony to join the Prussian partisan, but the latter was approaching the Baltic to put himself in communication with the English fleet and to receive from it arms and ammunition, which he lacked. Schill invaded Mecklenburg, and followed by 5,000 or 6,000 men, Prussian and Austrian deserters of Mecklenburgers, whom he had enrolled, and a multitude of vagrants, he entered the city of Stralsund, which he had fortified. General Grecian, I'm not quite sure about the name of this general, with a Dutch division backed up by a column of Danish soldiers, marched on Stralsund and carried its retrenchments by storm. Schill, to cover his retreat, had wished to set fire to the city, in which a stubborn street-by-street fight was fought. The whole band was taken or killed, and Schill himself lost his life.